One really important factor when it comes to flavor is browning. And browning is the sort of layman's terms for caramelization and the Maillard reaction. Now, these are two really interesting, really important scientific concepts when it comes to food. Caramelization, which I could not say straight if my life depended on it, caramelization is what happens when you heat sugars. You add sugar to a hot pan or any source of heat, and what happens is those sugars heat up, and as they go up in temperature and go up above 300 degrees, 320 degrees, 340 degrees, they start to brown. What happens when sugars brown, carbohydrates, actually any carbohydrates start to brown, they develop much more complex flavors. They actually change at a chemical level. Like they develop all sorts of new flavors that weren't there to begin with. They go from just being sweet and sort of like one note sweet to being nutty and earthy and savory and even a little bit bitter if you know how to take it right to the very edge and enjoy it, like a really good dark caramel that's taken right to the very edge of caramelization right before burning so that you get a really beautiful, slightly burnt taste, but not so bitter that it overpowers. That's caramelization. The really interesting thing about vegetables or other non-sweet items or items that don't taste sweet when you eat them is they actually contain a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar. So as you cook them, these normally non-sweet items actually become very sweet. So if you take an onion, which if you eat an onion, probably the last thing you're thinking is that it tastes sweet, it is a complete game changer. So onions and all oleums, especially garlic, have a lot of sugar in them. You might not taste it, but it's there. So what happens if you caramelize onions, if you cook them really slowly over really low heat for a really long time and the temperature of that onion starts to raise really slowly, what it causes is all of the sugars in the onions to start to melt and meld together and gently brown. And that's how you get caramelized onions. Caramelized onions are one of the most incredible flavor additions you can make. They're super easy. Really, the only thing in them is onions and maybe a little water. And what happens is the normally non-sweet onions slowly caramelize, the carbohydrates break down, those sugars break down, and you end up with this beautiful caramely sweet notes that the onions didn't originally have. That'll actually happen for a lot of vegetables. It'll happen with carrots, it'll happen with beets, even though beets and carrots taste really sweet. They actually become more sweet as you caramelize them, and they develop like much more meaty notes, they're earthy notes, they're nutty, they become really delicious. The one thing you have to be careful of is if you over caramelize something, the flavors can kind of tend to the bitter or the sour. Like if you caramelize something just a little too much, depending on what the item is, it can become kind of sour, and you'll get like a weird flavor down here. You'll feel it in your mouth and your palate, and it's just not good. If you really burn the holy shit out of it, well, it becomes bitter. Like I said earlier, with caramel, you can kind of work with that. You can take something really, really close to burnt and just get a little bit of bitter hint, which can actually be appealing. But if you burn sugars or any sort of carbohydrates, they become super bitter, and unfortunately, there's really no saving them. Just past the caramelization process, which I can now say without stuttering, yay for that, is the Maillard reaction. Now, the Maillard reaction is a really interesting process, and it's named after the French scientist that discovered it. Now, the Maillard reaction is what you get when you heat something that contains both a carbohydrate and a protein, and that would be meat. You might not really realize it, but meats actually contain a fair number of carbohydrates. We have carbohydrates in our bodies, and so do animals. So when you cook meat, you're warming these compounds which together contain proteins and carbohydrates. Now what happens when you heat something that contains both proteins and carbohydrates is you get browning. It's a very different browning that you get from caramelization. This is more of like a sticking to the pan kind of browning. And this happens because the carbohydrates start to break down, just like they do in caramelization, but also the proteins start to denature and the proteins start to break down and realign and do interesting things. And this is why browned meat tastes so good. This is why when you're like making a stew or you're making a roast, you really want to sear that meat so that you get like a big, beautiful browning on it. And actually, later on, you're going to find a lesson on how to brown meat so that you can do it perfectly every single time. But that browning is like the source of flavor. That's the source of meatiness. It's the source of like that savory satisfaction that you can feel deep down in your soul. Right? Like you can have a dish and it's got great salt, it's got great acid, it's got great sweetness, but if it's missing that savory note, especially if it's got meat in it, it's just not going to hit like that pinnacle point. Like if you brown your meat and you nail your salt and acid and sweetness, then you've got a dish that sings and everybody is going to be super impressed with whatever you're serving them. Now, one really important factor when it comes to browning meats and triggering the Maillard reaction is the evaporation of water. So if you take a piece of meat and you put it in a pan, it might look like it's stuck to the pan, and it probably actually is stuck to the pan. But what's actually happening on a chemical level is the heat is pulling out all the water from that item. And so you might not be able to see it, but there's a very thin layer of steam separating the meat from the pan. And what's happening is that little layer of steam is keeping the surfaces of the meat at 212 degrees. Since the Maillard reaction happens at over 300 degrees, you need to wait for that water to evaporate before it starts to happen. Now, this is why when you put meat in a pan to brown, you need to let it sit. And this also goes for vegetables. Like if you futz with it and move it around, it'll brown a little bit, but you won't get that beautiful brown searing that you're really looking for. And it might be sticking. You might be nervous thinking it's going to stick and it's going to shred, but there's a little trick to this. And if you take meat and put it on a pan, as long as it's well oiled and there's like a good layer of fat in there, if you let it sit in place, it'll do all the work itself. It's amazing. So if you let it sit there and you stick and you notice that like it's stuck to the pan and it's going to tear, that means it's not ready. If you just let it sit there, as long as it needs to sit there, when it's at that perfect stage of browning, it will release on its own. And that's a big secret when it comes to browning. Like a lot of people move their food around the pan because they're afraid it's going to stick. They're not going to be able to save it. It's going to ruin their meal. Just leave it. Because browning is a really interesting intersection between patience and vigilance. Patience comes in because you need to be patient. You need to let it sit there. You need to not mess with it. But vigilance comes in because we need to remember that browning is super close to burning. So if you get up and you walk away, it's not going to work. Like as soon as you get to that point of like perfect browning, burning is right behind it. You cannot walk away from something you're browning, whether it be a vegetable or a meat. You want to sit there and watch it. And as soon as it's ready to release from the pan, that's your cue to flip it over. One more really important factor when it comes to browning meat or browning vegetables or browning anything really is you don't want to crowd the pan. Because if you remember what I talked about earlier, how water escapes from these pieces of food as you put them in the pan, like there's water in all food, right? What happens is when you heat it, that water escapes and it kind of goes off in all directions. Well, if you crowd your pan, if you have a pan and you fill it with food so that everything's almost touching, they don't actually cook very well. What happens is the water that's escaping via steam from the piece next to a piece of food is actually kind of coming out and steaming the piece next to it. Well, what's happening is that water is actually touching this piece of food. Well, if water is like coming over here and hitting this piece of food, it's not browning, it's steaming. So the key to perfect browning is to making sure you have a good amount of food in your pan, but still keep a little amount of space between each of them. Like I like to keep at least a ½ inch, like bare minimum, ideally 1 inch. If you're running into a point where you don't think you're going to be able to fit everything into the pan, that's totally fine. You just need to do more than one batch. What you do is you brown your food, flip it over, make sure you brown all sides. You don't want to brown just one side of your food. You want to flip it over and make sure as much of the surface area of the food is browned as possible. Then take those out of the pan, move it to a plate, maybe clean out the pan if you need to, but you want to save those little fond pieces. So if it's not burning and there's browning on the bottom of the pan, you want to save that. Add a little bit more oil and add more of your food to the pan and then brown them in batches. Browning is one of your most important elements of flavor. It adds complexity, it adds a savory factor that you're not going to find anywhere else. It's right up there with being just as important as salt and acid.